Well, I am standing in a room of uber meritocrats devoted to the project of attacking meritocracy, which means I'll spend a lot of my time attacking all of you. Now, I think it'll be okay for two reasons. The first is that one of my themes is going to be that meritocracy makes the elites gluttons for punishment, so you'll enjoy being attacked. The second is that I'm genuinely interested in what you think, and please, after the debate is over, you have my name. If you have thoughts, send them to me. I want to make 3 points. The first is that meritocracy excludes most of society from meaningful access to advantage, not because we live in an inadequate meritocracy, but because meritocracy is operating as designed. The second is that meritocracy ensnares even those who seem to succeed in a web of effort, manipulation, self-distortion that harms them. And the third is that meritocracy does both of these things by focusing all our energies on things that are shallow and not worthy, instead of on the human excellences that we should in fact individually and collectively aspire to achieve. Let me begin with the first. If I look around this room of Oxford undergraduates, 40% of you were privately educated in a country in which 7% of students have private educations. 80% of you come from meaningful social and economic privilege. As we heard a moment ago, at my university, Yale, there are more students from the top 1% of the income distribution than from the entire bottom half. Now, my university's admissions process is corrupt, and failures of meritocracy might explain it. But Oxford's is not corrupt. You can't buy a place here. There is no meaningful legacy preference. And yet, nevertheless, you're all rich, and you all come from privileged backgrounds, or almost all. Now, why is that? The reason is straightforward. Famous US baseball player once said, "Practice doesn't make perfect, perfect practice makes perfect." Meritocracy, in fact, is not, as we just heard, that advantage turns on effort and talent. It turns on effort and talent, and one more thing, investment. It turns on how much is invested in developing a child's talent using their own efforts. And the investment that different kinds of children get in meritocratic societies is absolutely enormously different. In the United States, the richest private schools spend over $75,000 per pupil per year on educating their children, in a society in which public schools on average spend about $12,000. In this country, the richest private schools spend over £30,000 a year educating their children. These massive investments produce massive differences in childhood achievement, not because of legacy admissions, but because when you get trained, you get good at things. And the result, therefore, is that a meritocracy, when it works as designed, favors those whose parents are in a position best to invest in them, who have the money, who have the skills, and who have the free energy and space to do so. And believe me, meritocrats give rich parents the ability to do so. I'll get it in 1 second. When Michael Young invented the term meritocracy, the richest in England had only half the share of national income that they have today. The richest 10% of earners made twice as much as the poorest 10% of earners. Today, they make 4 times as much. A graduate of this university will make 50% more in her first year out than a graduate of the University of York. So meritocracy creates an inequality in which rich parents have the opportunity to spend all this money on their children, which is why meritocratic children are also rich children. That's the first point. Meritocracy excludes most of society from meaningful advantage. Second point, it's not actually fun to have that much invested in you as a kid. It's not easy. You are poked and prodded and tested and subject to tutors and classes and extra help and schools and exams, and you do this from the earliest age up until adulthood, and then you come here and you work hard, and then you get a job at McKinsey or Goldman Sachs and you work 80 hours a week, then you become parents, and you live in fear that your children will lose the caste that you have acquired by working so hard. And so as parents, you do two jobs. You squeeze into your children the same thing that was squeezed into you as you're working to try to make the money to enable you to do that. It's not surprising that in England, exam anxiety has now overtaken body image as the largest source of stress in wealthy children. It's not surprising that in a study of a wealthy American private school, 50% of children had moderate to severe clinical symptoms of depression, and 75% had moderate to severe clinical symptoms of anxiety. These are not easy lives to live. You will be extremely wealthy, wealthier than you can imagine, wealthier than prior elites have been, but you will not be well, and your children will not be well. And so even as meritocracy excludes everyone else, it will ensnare those of us in this room who are fortunate. But that doesn't mean that in human terms, it serves our interests. That's the second point. Third point, meritocracy distorts what we value and how we value it. To begin with, meritocracy has to decide what merit is. Every meritocracy invents its own way. The Qing dynasty in China had a particular kind of exam-based system based on classical learning and a certain form of erudition. Our meritocracy also has an exam-based system based on the tests you need to take to get into places like this, and then a market-based system based on how much your labor is in demand in a market economy that's largely deregulated under neoliberalism. Now, we all know we're good at exams, but we also know there's all the difference in the world between being able to take a good test and actually understanding something. And there's an even greater difference between test taking and wisdom. An exam-focused education distorts us on trying to learn to the test rather than try to understand the world around us or ourselves. John Dewey said that education is the process of coming to terms with your role in the world. Taking tests to get into university is not that process. Second of all, meritocracy massively distorts how we think of ourselves and how we value ourselves. Meritocracy teaches that the elite deserves its advantages. And the lived experience of the meritocrat, precisely because it's so hard to be one, is one that validates that teaching. This is not a group of wastrels or layabouts. This is a group of extremely earnest, hardworking, serious people who have sacrificed a lot to get here.
Daniel Markovits, a Yale Law Professor, has become one of the most important critics of American so-called meritocracy. In his argument is that the very system Americans are taught to admire, one based on merit, achievement, and fairness, is in fact the lies that trap both poor whites and black in cycles of disadvantage. The idea of meritocracy suggests that through hard work, intelligence, and perseverance, anyone can rise. But in reality, the system is designed to reproduce privilege for elites while creating suffering for everyone else. What looks like fairness on the surface is, in truth, a sophisticated way of justifying inequality and maintaining class hierarchy. I want you to join me in this discussion today. The topic is meritocracy. So many times have seen a state of hopelessness in the United States, people with college degrees, people with all these accolades, but at the end of it all, they haven't made it. And while they were in the process of perseverance, hard work, they were told that that's what's going to make you work. But again, they are lied to that if you work hard, you're going to achieve everything that you might want. Well, that might sound like it's the truth, because if you follow that path, of course, it will happen. But this doesn't seem to be happening to everyone, because we have special cases of people, and this is something that doesn't happen to everyone. And so when we have these people who they don't end up successful as they were promised or as they were lied, it makes them feel like they're the ones who made the mistake and not the system. American blacks have always been told to, they've been told to pull themselves by their own bootstraps. This means that the blame is not shifted in the system that lied to them, but the blame is shifted towards them. I want us to have a talk about this topic. For the longest time, this is something that has been going on. I've seen a lot of people depressed, young people using alcohol, drugs because they were lied to. And when they wake up to the reality, the elites made it look like it's their fault for this happening. And so as a result, this brings us to this discussion that the Yale Law Professor who talks about the question of meritocracy. So let's watch the video. I'll be back and then I'll be sharing my thoughts at the end of it all. Most importantly, I want you to tell me what you think about this in the comment section. Let's have a discussion in regards to this. For those who are watching me for the first time, I'm just asking you to please subscribe to the channel, join the membership, and really get to see what I can offer you. But until then, let's watch the video. I'll be back. You know, I love you guys. So let's get into it. I'll be back.
And they've done it under an ideology that says when you sacrifice in this way, that's the effort, and you do really well at something, that's the talent, then you've earned it and you deserve it. And so meritocracy creates an elite that is indifferent to the common good and that believes in its own entitlements, which is very damaging for society and not so great for the elite either. At the same time, meritocracy tells the rest of society that it's their fault that they aren't in this room. That if they'd been a little more talented, if they'd been a little harder working, if they'd been a little more virtuous, if they'd had a little more merit, then they would have been able to measure up. They would have succeeded. And so they are to blame for what is in fact a form of structural exclusion. And so meritocracy makes the elite smug and leaves everyone else naked in their rejection. And that's an extremely damaging place to be. That explains why in your country and in my country, those who are excluded by meritocracy now have a lower life expectancy than they did 3 years ago. Let me be clear, there has been no other time and place in human history in which absent war or massively fatal plague, and COVID is not that plague, there's been a diminution in life expectancy for a large segment of the population. The source is addiction, the source is alcoholism, the source is obesity, the source is suicide. These are internalized forms of self-hatred produced by what meritocracy says to the people whom it excludes, just as neoliberalism and Davos are internalized forms of conceit produced by what meritocracy says to the elite. So once again, meritocracy excludes most people from advantage. It ensnares the rich in a web of effort and distortion. And it distorts all of us individually and collectively, making us value the wrong things in the wrong ways and for the wrong reasons, which is, as the motion says, why there is no merit in meritocracy, or why, as I would say, merit is a sham.
Of this motion with a personal anecdote. I was born and raised in Hong Kong, a purportedly meritocratic city. I have fond memories of being shoved into piano lessons, swimming lessons, dancing lessons from the age of 3 because my parents were reasonably well off, they had connections, and they were able to send me to such classes knowing that it will prepare me well for the future. In the same city, I lived with lots of other students who did not have such an opportunity. I lived with lots of other people who had to languish in local schools that were underfunded, that did not have the opportunity to learn to speak English properly because Hong Kong did not recognize English as an important enough secondary language for most of the students that studied there. That is why, personally, I firmly stand on the side that there is no merit to meritocracy. I will be providing 3 arguments in my speech. Firstly, how there is no real meritocracy that currently exists. Secondly, that the narrative of meritocracy erodes the common good. And lastly, that meritocracy is principally unjust. Before that, it falls upon me to introduce the speakers on the opposition side. Speaking first on opposition, we have Daniel Dipper, the press and sponsorship officer from Magdalen College, who is also the JCR president in his college. I'm quite surprised that he is on opposition in tonight's debate. Given his work for access and social mobility, I think it would be quite difficult for him to argue that meritocracy is a good thing and exists. However, I don't think I need any further insults for Daniel, given you're going to hear him speak right after I finish my speech. The second speaker on side opposition is Adrian Woolridge, who is a political editor and columnist for The Economist, which is a publication that I have read devotedly from the age of 10. He was surprisingly normal at dinner. I was trying to get some weird quotes off him so I could kind of poke fun at him for this debate, despite being an All Souls Fellow. So props to him for that. The third speaker on side opposition is Bin Aflami MP, the Conservative MP for Hitchin and Harpenden and the patronage of multiple charities. I think that as a Tory MP, he would be trying very, very hard in today's debate to talk about why meritocracy exists and should exist, given the policies that his government have been implementing. The last concluding speaker for side opposition is Jacobus Peterson, a good friend of mine and a member of Secretary's Committee at St. Peter's College. I think that the fact that he studies geography speaks for itself about the quality of the speech you're going to hear from him. These are your opposition speakers, Mr. President, and they are most welcome. So, first argument for my speech: why there is no real meritocracy in today's society. Let me give you an example of Ivy League admissions, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, given the scandal that has plagued the front page of news in the past few months. There are currently more students in Ivy League universities from the top 1% in America than the bottom half of America combined. Surely that says something about the so-called meritocratic institutions that the Ivy League is so proud of. Surely it says something when legacy admissions are given so much priority when you have privileged parents who are able to donate millions of dollars to build new science and technology centers that guarantees you a place of admission. All this, and Oxbridge admissions as well, as we are all familiar with, shows that meritocracy is not real. The current system we live under says that we are able to use our abilities to get what we want, says that if we work hard enough, if we're smart enough, if we're talented enough, we can do whatever we want in life. This is exactly what the American dream tells us, right? If we work hard enough at a tech startup, we can become the next Jeff Bezos, we can become the next Elon Musk. The sad reality is that that just isn't true. Your family background, your upbringing, everything informs how much you're going to succeed in the future. If you were born to well-off parents, you are much more likely to be in the upper middle class or in the upper class when you graduate from university. Let's just track the life of a normal kid who is from an upper middle class family. They go to preschool, that is, $50K a year in America. They learn the best languages, they go for extracurricular activities, they learn French, they spend their weekends in museums, they spend their weekends looking at art, appreciating music, opera, everything, from the young age of 5. This continues when they're in primary school, when they're in secondary school, when parents are able to provide the best education to them that costs thousands of dollars, which the normal family just cannot afford. With this education, they get lots of different contacts from different people. They get connections to the rich, to the elite, to the wealthy, and they're able to get into a college of their choice where their parents donate millions of dollars, or even when they are getting private tuition for their SATs, when they get private tuitions for TSAs to come to Oxford, for example. Yes.
I thank the Honourable Lady for that. Is the proposition's case that we have a meritocratic system, or is it that we do not?
I argue that the current system purports to be a meritocracy, but is not actually a meritocracy. It is merely a guise under which people are told that if you do badly, if you suffer, you deserve it. And that's why I stand so firmly on that proposition. Second argument, on why the narrative of meritocracy erodes the common good. Let's assume for a minute that meritocracy does actually exist, and that you are rewarded based on your talents and your hard work. Why is meritocracy still such an awful thing? This is because meritocracy justifies doing absolutely terrible things to people who, through no fault of their own, are in unfortunate circumstances. For people who have lost their jobs, for people who currently are suffering because they're homeless, because they're under a credit system or a welfare system that just doesn't give them enough to live day by day, under a government that has cut £20 off a welfare system which people live off of. This is what meritocracy justifies. When you tell people that where you are currently in society is completely because of the effort you've put in, and this is the reward you get if this is what you have put in, this justifies doing absolutely awful things to people. It justifies no redistributive system. It justifies leaving people in the dark. It justifies people falling through the cracks because you're telling them that they deserve this. When in reality, as I've told you, people don't. People are born in unfortunate circumstances. People might make a mistake and lose their job and never be able to recover from that. That's why the narrative of the meritocracy itself erodes this idea of the common good and makes society much worse off than it is. No, thank you. Third argument, why meritocracy is principally unjust. So again, let's imagine a world in which meritocracy actually exists, unlike the one we currently live in. Let's assume that everyone is actually rewarded based on their talents, based on their hard work, and there isn't actually money, wealth, power that comes into play, that your birth does not determine how well you actually perform later in life. Why, even in such a system, do we still believe that meritocracy is principally unjust? Look at yourselves and ask yourself, how much did you actually have to work for your talents? Intelligence is something that is inborn, something that is innate. You were born with a certain amount of intelligence. You were born with a certain capacity to understand and to digest new information. Even though that can be modified later in your life, given the schooling you receive, given the training you receive, a lot of that is determined by genetics. Why does that make you more liable to certain good things? Why does that mean you deserve certain good things more? Why does that mean you deserve certain rewards? When other people, just by the chance of birth lottery, happen to not have the gifts you have. Principally, it is completely unfair to reward people based on arbitrary grounds of what intelligence they are born with. Some people might have genes that allow them or give them the direction to work harder than other people. Some people might find it very difficult to focus, to work hard, etc. Again, a lot of this is innate and genetically determined. So it is completely arbitrary for us to reward certain people above others just because of their inborn talents or because of how hard they work. Ladies and gentlemen, when you choose which door to walk through tonight, ask yourself this. Most of us here are Oxford students, but have we worked much harder than other people who didn't get into this institution? Or is it because we were born with certain talents that we didn't work for? Is it because we were born with certain talents just because our parents happened to have good genes that gave us the ability to succeed in this institution? If you think any of these things, make sure to walk through the door of the eyes. Thank you very much.
Markowitz explains that meritocracy began as a rebellion against aristocracy. Instead of wealth and privilege being inherited through family ties, America promoted the idea that achievement would come through education and individual effort. But over time, this system was captured by the wealthy. Rich families could afford the best schools, tutors, and resources. Right. While the poor were left with underfunded schools and limited opportunities. The result is that the elite continue to pass down privilege to their children, not through noble titles, but through elite education and professional training. For poor whites and blacks, the promise of meritocracy becomes an illusion. Education is at the heart of this lie. Elite universities like Yale, Harvard, and Stanford market themselves as gateways for anyone with talent. But in practice, access to these institutions overwhelmingly favors the wealthy. Rich families invest tens of thousands of dollars into preparing their children from an early age. Private schools, extracurricular activity, standardized test preparations. By the time applications are due, these children are already far ahead of their working class peers, regardless of their innate ability. Poor whites in small towns and blacks in urban schools are effectively locked out, making education less about merit and more about wealth disguised as achievement. Also, another key point that Markowitz raises is how meritocracy exploits labor. Professional jobs in law, finance, medicine, and technology are often portrayed as reward for hard work, but in reality, these jobs demand extreme hours and relentless pressure, often leaving workers exhausted and alienated. The working class is excluded from these jobs, while those who do enter them sacrifice their well-being in order to maintain elite status. For poor and working class Americans, this means not only exclusion from high-paying professions, but also exploitation in low-wage jobs that offer little dignity or sacrifice. Both ends up on the spectrum are trapped. Elites by overwork, the poor by exclusion. Now, for poor whites, the myth of meritocracy carries a special sting. Many are told that if they work harder, they can rise out of small towns and struggling communities. But the collapse of manufacturing, the decline of unions, and the concentration of wealth in the elite cities make that impossible. They are disillusioned, feeling betrayed by a system that promised mobility but delivered stagnation. This disillusionment often fuels resentment, making them vulnerable to political movements that scapegoats immigrants and minorities, instead of addressing the structural design of inequality. The lie of meritocracy becomes not only economic but political, dividing citizens against one another. We cannot talk about this and fail to talk about American blacks. For Black Americans, the lie of meritocracy intersects with racism. Even when Black students excel academically, they face systemic barriers in the job market, housing, and wealth accumulations. Generations of exclusion mean that Black families often cannot provide the same financial support or elite network with what white families can. This means that Black people are often working twice as hard for half the recognition. When the system tells them that America is fair and that success is based on merit, it erases the reality of structural racism. The lie is especially cruel here because it denies the persistence of racial inequality while pretending that equal opportunity exists for everyone. Markowitz also highlights how meritocracy breeds social resentment. By concentrating wealth and opportunity in the hands of a narrow elite, it creates a divide between those inside the system and those excluded. The elite professionals in finance, law, and technology increasingly live separate lives in gated communities and elite neighborhoods, disconnected from the struggles of ordinary citizens. This fuels alienation and mistrusts, as poor whites and blacks alike feel excluded from the very institutions that claim to represent fairness. Meritocracy, instead of building societies together, it tears it apart by legitimizing inequality as deserved. Also, the cultural impact of this lie is equally damaging. The myth of meritocracy shifts the blame for failure onto individuals rather than the system. A poor person is told that if they do not succeed, it is because they lack talent or discipline, not because the system was rigged against them. This creates deep shame and hopelessness, reinforcing cycles of poverty. For working-class Americans of all races, this psychological manipulation ensures compliance. They blame themselves for conditions that are actually produced by systemic inequality. It is a form of cruelty disguised as opportunity. Markowitz also argued that the meritocratic elites are not truly free either. They are trapped in a cycle of overwork and competition that leaves them burned out and disconnected from ordinary life. The system consumes even those at the top, demanding endless achievements to justify their status. In this way, meritocracy becomes a machine of suffering that harms both the excluded and the included. Poor whites and blacks are crushed by exclusion. Elites are crushed by exhaustion. The lie sustains itself by convincing both groups that this is the only way society can function. And lastly, the phenomenon Markowitz exposes is that meritocracy is not fair system of opportunity. It is a new aristocracy disguised in language of fairness. It maintains inequality by giving elites the tool to pass down privilege while blaming the poor for their exclusion. For poor whites and blacks, the result is the same: disillusionment, economic stagnation, and generational disadvantage. By unmasking this lie, Markowitz challenged America to rethink its entire system of education, work, and reward. Until that happens, the myth of meritocracy will continue to produce suffering, resentment, and division rather than fairness it claims to deliver. I'm your host and presenter, Ejito Stories, but until then, let me see you in my next video. Peace, love, and harmony. Salute.